The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Charles stood at the tall windows of his private study, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 75, the king had weathered many storms during his long wait for the throne, but nothing had prepared him for the conversation he was about to have with his wife. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8 times, its resonant notes echoing through the high-ceilinged room filled with centuries of royal history. Camilla entered quietly, her silk dress rustling softly against the Persian carpet. She had requested this private meeting the evening before, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something more serious, more urgent. Charles turned to face her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she avoided his direct gaze. "You wanted to speak with me about Anne," he said, his voice carrying the weight of brotherly concern that had developed over decades of sibling relationships within the royal family. Camilla nodded, settling into the burgundy leather chair that had once belonged to his grandmother. She smoothed her skirt nervously, a gesture Charles had learned to recognize as a sign that whatever she was about to share would be significant. "Charles, there's something about your sister that you need to know," she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. Something that could affect the entire family, and the monarchy itself. The king felt his heart rate quicken. Princess Anne had always been the most straightforward member of the royal family, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties and her fierce independence. She had earned respect both within the family and among the British public for her tireless work ethic and her refusal to be drawn into the drama that had plagued other royals over the years. "What about Anne?" Charles asked, moving to sit across from his wife. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the room, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for the conversation that was about to unfold. Camilla took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I've discovered that Anne has been involved in something that goes far beyond her public duties. Something that she's kept hidden from all of us, including you." Charles leaned forward, his brow furrowing with concern. Anne had always been private, even by royal standards. But the idea that she was hiding something significant enough to warrant this level of concern from Camilla was deeply troubling. "Go on," he encouraged, though part of him dreaded what he might hear. 3 months ago, I was reviewing some correspondence that had been misfiled in my office," Camilla continued. "Among the papers was a series of letters that should have gone directly to Anne. The return addresses caught my attention because they were from organizations I didn't recognize, but they had official seals that suggested government connections." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. Throughout his years as heir apparent, he had learned that seemingly innocent correspondence could often hide much larger issues, particularly when it involved government agencies or international organizations. "I know I shouldn't have, but something about those letters troubled me," Camilla admitted. The formal language, the official seals, the fact that they were marked as personal and confidential for and specifically. So I made some discreet inquiries. The king's mind raced through possibilities, and had always been involved in numerous charitable organizations and had extensive international connections through her work with Save the Children and other humanitarian groups. But the secrecy surrounding these particular communications suggested something far more complex. "What did you discover?" Charles asked, though he could see from Camilla's expression that whatever she had learned had shaken her considerably. "And has been working as an unofficial diplomatic channel for the British government," Camilla revealed. "For the past 5 years, she's been conducting secret negotiations with foreign governments, particularly in situations where official diplomatic channels have failed or been compromised." Charles sat back in his chair, stunned. The implications of what Camilla was telling him were staggering. Members of the royal family were expected to remain politically neutral, avoiding any involvement in government affairs beyond their ceremonial duties. The idea that Anne had been actively participating in diplomatic activities without his knowledge, or apparently the knowledge of the Prime Minister's office, was unprecedented. "That's impossible," Charles said, though even as he spoke, he could see the conviction in Camilla's eyes. "And would never involve herself in political matters without proper authorization." "That's what I thought initially," Camilla replied. "But the evidence is overwhelming. She's been using her royal status and her international connections to access leaders and officials who have been unwilling to engage through traditional diplomatic channels. The letters I found were acknowledgments of her successful interventions in 3 major international disputes over the past 2 years." Charles rose from his chair and began pacing, a habit he had developed during times of stress. The Persian carpet muffled his footsteps as he tried to process what he was hearing, and had always been the most dutiful of his siblings, the one who understood the importance of protocol and tradition. The idea that she had been operating in secret, potentially putting the monarchy at risk, was almost incomprehensible. "What kind of disputes?" he asked, stopping to face Camilla directly. "According to the documentation I found, she played a crucial role in defusing a trade disagreement between Britain and several African nations that threatened to escalate into economic sanctions. She also facilitated communications between our government and certain Middle Eastern leaders during a period when official diplomatic relations had broken down completely." Camilla paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "But the most significant intervention involved her secret meetings with representatives from a major European power during the early stages of the conflict in Ukraine. She apparently helped establish communication channels that prevented what could have been a much more serious escalation of tensions." Charles felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. These were not minor charitable endeavors or ceremonial duties, and had been involved in matters of international security and diplomacy at the highest levels, operating without oversight from either the royal household or the government offices that should have been coordinating such activities. "How do you know all of this is accurate?" he asked, grasping for some possibility that Camilla's information might be incomplete or misunderstood. "I spent weeks verifying everything through my own contacts," Camilla replied. "I spoke with people I trust in the Foreign Office, former diplomatic staff, and even reached out to some international contacts who confirmed details without realizing why I was asking." "Charles, this is real, and it's been going on for years." The king returned to his chair, suddenly, feeling every one of his 75 years. The responsibility of the crown had always weighed heavily on him, but this revelation added an entirely new dimension to that burden. How could Anne have taken such risks without consulting him? How could she have potentially compromised the neutrality that was fundamental to the monarchy's role in modern Britain? "Has anyone else discovered this?" Charles asked, his mind immediately turning to the potential consequences if this information became public. "Not as far as I can determine," Camilla said. "But, Charles, that's not the most troubling part of what I've learned." The king looked up sharply. He had thought the revelation of Anne's secret diplomatic activities was shocking enough, but Camilla's expression suggested there was more to come. "The current government is not aware of her activities," Camilla continued. "The Prime Minister's office has no record of authorizing or even being informed about Anne's interventions. She's been operating completely independently, using her royal status and personal relationships to conduct what amounts to unauthorized foreign policy initiatives." Charles felt his hands begin to tremble slightly. The constitutional implications of what Camilla was describing were staggering. The royal family's role in modern British governance was carefully defined and strictly limited. For a member of the family to be conducting independent diplomatic activities without government knowledge or consent was not just inappropriate. It could be seen as a direct challenge to parliamentary democracy itself. "There's more," Camilla said quietly. "Some of the organizations she's been working with have connections to private intelligence networks. Not official government agencies, but groups that operate in the shadows of international relations, and may have unknowingly become involved with entities that have their own agendas, separate from British interests." The morning sun had climbed higher during their conversation, and the study was now filled with bright light that seemed to mock the darkness of what Charles was learning. He stood and walked to the window again, looking out over the grounds where tourists were already beginning to gather for the day's activities, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding within the castle walls. "Why are you telling me this now?" Charles asked, turning back to Camilla. "Why didn't you come to me as soon as you discovered it?" "Because I hoped I was wrong," Camilla admitted. "I spent weeks trying to find an innocent explanation, some way that Anne's activities could be justified or explained within the normal scope of royal duties. But the deeper I investigated, the more complex and potentially dangerous the situation became." Charles could see the strain that keeping this secret had placed on his wife. Camilla had always been protective of the royal family's reputation and stability, understanding perhaps better than anyone the delicate balance required to maintain public support for the monarchy in the modern era. "What triggered your decision to tell me today?" he asked. Camilla reached into her handbag and withdrew a manila envelope. "This arrived yesterday, addressed to and but delivered to my office by mistake again. It's from the same network she's been working with, and it contains details about a new assignment they want her to undertake." Charles took the envelope with hands that were no longer steady. The return address was innocuous enough, a consulting firm based in London, but The official seals and markings suggested something far more significant than typical business correspondence. Charles, they want her to facilitate a meeting between British officials and representatives from a country that's currently under international sanctions, Camilla said. If she proceeds with this, she could be violating both British law and international agreements. The king opened the envelope and scanned the contents quickly. The formal language and specific references to confidential diplomatic initiatives confirmed everything Camilla had told him. But, more than that, the tone of the letter suggested that, and was not just an occasional consultant to these operations. She was apparently a key figure in an ongoing network of unofficial diplomatic activities. How could she have hidden this from us for so long? Charles asked, more to himself than to Camilla. And has always been independent, Camilla replied. She travels frequently for her charitable work. She has extensive international contacts, and she's never been one to discuss her activities in detail with the family. It would have been relatively easy for her to incorporate these secret meetings into her regular schedule without anyone noticing. Charles sat down heavily, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. As king, he was responsible for the actions of every member of the royal family, but particularly for ensuring that their activities supported rather than undermined the constitutional framework within which the monarchy operated. "What do you think we should do?" he asked Camilla, grateful for her counsel during what was rapidly becoming one of the most challenging situations of his reign. "We need to confront and directly," Camilla said without hesitation. She needs to understand the risks she's been taking, not just to herself, but to the entire institution of the monarchy. And we need to find a way to extract her from these activities without creating an international incident or exposing the family to scandal. Charles nodded, though the prospect of confronting his sister about such a serious matter filled him with dread, and had always been strong-willed and protective of her independence. Convincing her to abandon activities that she apparently believed were serving important national interests would require careful handling. "When should we speak with her?" he asked. "She's expected back from Scotland this afternoon," Camilla replied. "I suggest we arrange a private family meeting this evening, away from staff and advisors. This needs to remain between us until we understand the full scope of what she's been involved in." Charles looked out the window again, watching as the normal activities of royal life continued around them. Guards changing shifts, staff members going about their duties, tourists taking photographs of the historic buildings that housed one of the world's oldest continuing monarchies. The contrast between the ordinary appearance of royal life and the extraordinary crisis they were facing was almost surreal. "Camilla," he said, turning back to his wife, "if this becomes public, it could be the end of everything we've worked to build. The public's trust in the monarchy, our relationship with the government, our international standing, all of it could be destroyed." "I know," Camilla replied softly. "That's why we have to handle this carefully, but decisively. And may have had good intentions, but she's put us all at risk." The clock chimed 9 times, marking the passage of another hour in what Charles was beginning to realize might be one of the most significant days of his reign. The conversation with Camilla had revealed not just and secret activities, but the vulnerability of the entire royal institution to the independent actions of its members. As he prepared to face his sister that evening, Charles could only hope that the bonds of family and duty that had held the monarchy together for over 1,000 years would be strong enough to survive the crisis that was about to unfold. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the blue drawing room as Charles waited for and to arrive. He had spent the hours since his conversation with Camilla reviewing constitutional precedents and considering the potential ramifications of his sister's activities. The weight of kingship had never felt heavier than it did in these moments of uncertainty. Camilla sat quietly beside him, occasionally glancing at the ornate clock that seemed to tick with unusual loudness in the tense atmosphere. They had agreed that she would remain present for the initial confrontation, given that she had uncovered the information and might need to provide details that Charles hadn't fully absorbed during their morning discussion. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Anne's arrival before the formal knock came at the door. Charles called for her to enter, steeling himself for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations he had ever had with any member of his family. Princess Anne entered with her characteristic brisk efficiency, still wearing her travel clothes from the journey back from Scotland. At 73, she retained the bearing and energy that had made her one of the most respected working members of the royal family. Her graying hair was pulled back in her typical no-nonsense style, and her expression was businesslike as she approached her brother and sister-in-law. "Charles, Camilla," she said with a brief nod. settling into the chair across from them. I understand you wanted to speak with me urgently about something. Charles studied his sister's face, looking for any sign that she might suspect the purpose of this meeting. Anne's expression remained neutral, though he detected a slight wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there in their recent family gatherings. And he began carefully. We need to discuss some activities that have come to our attention. Activities that may have significant implications for the family and the monarchy. Anne's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. What sort of activities? Camilla leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. And we know about your work with the diplomatic network. The secret negotiations, the unofficial channels you've been facilitating between the British government and foreign entities. For a moment, Anne's face remained completely expressionless. Then, slowly, Charles watched as his sister's carefully maintained composure began to shift. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and she leaned back in her chair with what might have been relief or resignation. How long have you known? Anne asked quietly. I discovered it 3 months ago, Camilla replied. I've spent that time trying to understand the full scope of what you've been involved in. And nodded slowly, her gaze moving between Charles and Camilla. And what exactly do you think you understand? Charles felt a flash of frustration at his sister's evasiveness, but he forced himself to remain calm. We understand that you've been conducting unauthorized diplomatic activities for the past 5 years. We understand that you've been working with organizations that operate outside official government channels. And we understand that your current assignment involves facilitating contact with sanctioned entities, which could put you in violation of both British and international law. Anne was quiet for several moments, her fingers drumming silently on the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of conviction that Charles found both admirable and deeply troubling. Everything I've done has been in service to this country, she said firmly. Every meeting, every negotiation, every risk I've taken has been to prevent conflicts that could have cost British lives and damaged our national interests. But, Charles said, his voice rising slightly with emotion, you've been operating without oversight, without authorization, without any of the safeguards that exist to protect both you and the monarchy from exactly this kind of situation. The safeguards you're talking about are often the very obstacles that prevent real progress from being made, Anne replied, her own voice becoming more animated. While official diplomats spend months arranging meetings that may never happen, while politicians posture for domestic audiences, real crises develop and escalate. Someone has to be willing to step outside the formal structures when those structures are failing. Camilla exchanged a glance with Charles before responding. But that someone doesn't have to be you, Anne. You're a senior member of the royal family. Your actions reflect on all of us, and on the institution of the monarchy itself. The monarchy survives by being relevant and shot back, by serving the people and the nation in meaningful ways. What good is our position if we can't use it to actually help when help is desperately needed? Charles could see that this conversation was not going to unfold as he had hoped, and wasn't expressing regret or acknowledging the risks she had created. Instead, she was defending her actions with the same passionate commitment that had always characterized her approach to royal duties. Tell us about the current situation, Charles said, deciding to focus on immediate concerns rather than past decisions. The assignment involving sanctioned entities. Anne's expression grew more serious. There's a humanitarian crisis developing in a region where official diplomatic contact has been severed due to sanctions. Children are dying, Charles. Entire communities are being displaced, and the international community's response has been paralyzed by political considerations. That doesn't justify breaking international law, Camilla interjected. Doesn't it? Anne asked sharply. When did following rules become more important than saving lives? When did the royal family become so risk-averse that we're willing to watch preventable tragedies unfold rather than take action that might be controversial? Charles felt his chest tighten with a mixture of anger and admiration for his sister's convictions. Throughout their lives, Anne had been the family member most committed to using her royal status for practical good rather than ceremonial purposes. But her current activities went far beyond anything that could be considered appropriate for a constitutional monarch's family member. And you're not just risking your own reputation, he said, trying to make her understand the broader implications. If your activities become public, they could be used to argue that the royal family is interfering in governmental affairs. They could undermine the entire constitutional arrangement that allows the monarchy to exist in a democratic society. The constitutional arrangement is already under pressure, Anne replied. Public support for the monarchy continues to decline with each generation. Maybe it's time we started earning that support through action rather than just tradition and ceremony. The room fell silent as the implications of Anne's words settled over them. She wasn't just defending her specific actions. She was challenging the fundamental approach that the royal family had taken to their role in modern Britain. "You're talking about fundamentally changing what we are," Charles said slowly. "You're talking about abandoning centuries of constitutional development. I'm talking about evolution, and corrected. About adapting to a world where people expect their leaders to lead, not just follow carefully scripted protocols." Camilla leaned forward, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "And I understand your frustration with the limitations of royal life. But what you're proposing could destroy everything this family has built. It could end the monarchy entirely. And would that necessarily be a bad thing?" And asked, her question hanging in the air like a challenge. "If we can't justify our existence through meaningful service, if we're just expensive symbols preserved for tourist revenue and national nostalgia, maybe we deserve to become irrelevant." Charles felt as though his sister had struck him physically. The idea that any member of the royal family would question the fundamental value of the monarchy was almost incomprehensible to him. The crown represented continuity, stability, and connection to a history that defined British identity. "How can you say that?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "How can you dismiss 1,000 years of history, of service, of connection between the crown and the people?" "I'm not dismissing it," Anne said, her tone softening slightly as she saw the pain her words had caused. "I'm asking whether we're honoring that history or betraying it. Our ancestors didn't preserve the monarchy by avoiding risk and controversy. They preserved it by being essential to the nation's survival and prosperity. But they operated within the constitutional framework of their times," Charles argued. "They didn't conduct independent foreign policy or violate international law. They also didn't live in an era where communication happens at light speed, where crises can develop and spiral out of control in hours rather than months," and replied. "The world has changed, Charles. Maybe we need to change with it." Camilla stood and walked to the window, clearly struggling with the direction the conversation was taking. When she turned back to face them, her expression was troubled. "And even if we accept your arguments about the need for evolution, you've been operating in secret. You've been lying to your family, to the government, and to the public about your activities. How is that honorable?" And was quiet for a moment, and Charles could see that Camilla's words had found their mark. When she spoke again, her voice was less certain than it had been. "I thought I could manage the risks," she admitted. "I thought I could limit my involvement to situations where the potential benefits clearly outweighed the dangers. But each success led to requests for more complex interventions, and each intervention created connections and obligations that were difficult to escape." "You're in too deep," Charles said, recognizing the admission implicit in his sister's words. "You've become dependent on these networks, and they've become dependent on you." "Perhaps," Anne acknowledged. "But walking away now would mean abandoning ongoing efforts that could save thousands of lives. The humanitarian situation I mentioned isn't theoretical, Charles. Real people are suffering while we debate constitutional proprieties." The afternoon light was fading as the conversation continued, and Charles realized that they were no closer to resolution than when they had begun, and remained committed to her activities, convinced that they were necessary and justified. Charles and Camilla remained convinced that those activities posed an unacceptable risk to the monarchy and to democratic governance. "What exactly are you asking of me?" And finally said, "Are you ordering me to abandon everything I've been working toward?" Charles looked at his sister, seeing both the woman who had been his companion through decades of royal life and a stranger whose convictions had led her into territory he couldn't follow. "I'm asking you to consider the consequences," he said carefully. "Not just to yourself, but to all of us. To the institution we represent, to the people who depend on that institution for stability and continuity. And I'm asking you to consider the consequences of inaction," and replied. "To the people who are dying while we maintain our careful neutrality, to the international crises that escalate while official diplomacy fails to respond effectively." The standoff between them was complete, and Charles realized that no amount of discussion was going to resolve their fundamental disagreement about the role and responsibilities of the royal family. Anne's convictions were as deeply held as his own, and she had 5 years of successful interventions to support her position. "What happens now?" Camilla asked, voicing the question that was foremost in everyone's minds. And stood, her bearing once again reflecting the determination that had characterized her throughout her royal life. "Now you have to decide whether you're going to support me or betray me," she said bluntly. "Whether you're going to help me manage the risks of continuing this work, or whether you're going to force me to choose between my family and my conscience." Charles felt his world shifting beneath him as he realized the impossible position his sister had created. Supporting her meant becoming complicit in activities that could destroy the monarchy. Opposing her meant potentially losing a family member whose dedication to service he had always admired, even as he questioned her current methods. "And, please," he said, rising to face her, "don't make this about loyalty to family versus loyalty to principle. We're all trying to serve the same values, just in different ways. Are we?" And asked, "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're more concerned with preserving your position than with using it effectively." The accusation hung between them like a sword, cutting through decades of shared experience and mutual respect. Charles realized that this conversation had revealed not just and secret activities, but fundamental differences in their understanding of what the monarchy should represent in the modern world. The evening air was heavy with tension as Charles stood alone in his private study, the weight of his conversation with and pressing down on him like a physical burden. Camilla had retired to her quarters to process what they had learned, leaving the king to grapple with the impossible choice his sister had presented to him. Through the tall windows, he could see the lights of Windsor beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, a peaceful scene that contrasted sharply with the turmoil in his mind. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. His private secretary entered with a concerned expression, carrying a leather folder that Charles recognized as containing urgent communications requiring immediate royal attention. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's been a development that requires your immediate consideration," the secretary said, his voice carrying an unusual note of gravity. Charles accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from fatigue or apprehension he couldn't say. Inside, he found a series of documents marked with the highest security classifications, along with a handwritten note from the Prime Minister requesting an urgent private meeting. "When did these arrive?" Charles asked, scanning the contents quickly. 20 minutes ago, sir. The Prime Minister's office has requested a secure video conference within the hour, if possible." Charles felt his heart sink as he read through the documents. Intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and security assessments, all relating to unauthorized contact between British entities and sanctioned foreign governments. Anne's activities hadn't just been discovered by his own family. They had apparently come to the attention of the highest levels of government security apparatus. "Please arrange the conference immediately," Charles instructed, "and inform the Queen Consort that I'll need to speak with her urgently after my call with the Prime Minister." As his secretary departed, Charles sank into his chair, suddenly, feeling every one of his 75 years. The crisis he had hoped to manage privately within the family had apparently expanded beyond his control. The documents suggested that intelligence services had been monitoring the unauthorized diplomatic activities for months, building a comprehensive picture of Anne's involvement with international networks. The secure video screen activated precisely on time, revealing the Prime Minister's familiar face, though her expression was more serious than Charles had ever seen it during their regular weekly meetings. "Your Majesty, thank you for making time for this urgent discussion," she began without the usual pleasantries that characterized their formal interactions. "Prime Minister, I assume this relates to the materials your office sent over," Charles replied, indicating the folder on his desk. "Indeed, sir. We've become aware of activities involving a member of your family that pose significant risks to British security and international relations. I'm afraid I must ask you directly. How long have you known about Princess Anne's unauthorized diplomatic interventions?" Charles felt a flush of heat rise in his cheeks. The directness of the question made it clear that the government's knowledge of Anne's activities was comprehensive and that any attempt at deflection would be both futile and damaging to his credibility. "I learned of these activities only this morning," he answered honestly. "My wife discovered correspondence that led to our investigation of the situation." The Prime Minister's expression softened slightly, though her concern remained evident. "Your Majesty, I want to be clear that we don't believe you had any knowledge of or involvement in these activities. However, the situation has become extremely delicate, and we need your cooperation to manage it effectively." "What exactly has the government discovered?" Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Princess Anne has been operating as an unofficial diplomatic channel for approximately 5 years," the Prime Minister explained. She's been facilitating communications between our government and foreign entities in situations where official diplomatic channels were considered inadequate or inappropriate. Charles felt confused. But wouldn't such activities require government authorization? The Prime Minister paused, and Charles could see her choosing her words carefully. That's where the situation becomes complicated, Your Majesty. Some of Princess Anne's early activities were conducted with the knowledge and informal approval of previous government officials. However, those arrangements were never formalized, and subsequent governments were not informed of her ongoing involvement. The implications of what she was saying hit Charles like a physical blow. Are you telling me that my sister was initially recruited by the British government for these activities? Not recruited, exactly, the Prime Minister replied. But approximately 6 years ago, during a particularly sensitive international crisis, Princess Anne's unique position and international contacts made her invaluable and formal asset. What began as a one-time consultation evolved into a more extensive relationship that appears to have continued without proper oversight. Charles stood and began pacing, his mind reeling with this new information, and hadn't simply decided to involve herself in diplomatic activities. She had been drawn into a web of semi-official arrangements that had grown beyond anyone's control. Why wasn't I informed of any of this? He asked, his voice rising with indignation. Because the arrangements were always intended to be temporary and informal, the Prime Minister explained. Each individual intervention was seen as a unique situation that didn't require the formal protocols that would apply to official diplomatic activities. No one anticipated that these occasional consultations would develop into a comprehensive network of ongoing relationships. And now those relationships have become a security risk, Charles said, understanding the trajectory of events even before the Prime Minister confirmed his assessment. I'm afraid so, Your Majesty. Princess Anne's contacts have expanded to include entities that we cannot fully verify or control. Some of the organizations she's been working with have connections to private intelligence networks that operate outside the oversight of any national government. Charles returned to his chair, the full scope of the crisis becoming clear to him. And hadn't just been conducting unauthorized diplomacy. She had unknowingly become involved with international networks whose loyalties and objectives were unclear. What does the government want from me? He asked directly. We need Princess Anne to cease all contact with these networks immediately, the Prime Minister said firmly. We also need her full cooperation in debriefing sessions with our security services to ensure that we understand the complete scope of her involvement and can assess any ongoing risks. And if she refuses? The Prime Minister's expression became grave. Then, we would have to consider more formal interventions. The current situation involves potential violations of sanctions regimes and unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence entities. If Princess Anne continues these activities, she could face serious legal consequences. Charles felt the walls of his study closing in around him. The choice that Anne had presented to him earlier, support her activities or betray her, had become even more complex. Now it wasn't just about family loyalty or constitutional propriety. It was about protecting his sister from criminal charges while safeguarding national security. How much time do I have to convince her to cooperate? Charles asked. The situation is developing rapidly, Your Majesty. We understand that this is a family matter as well as a security issue, but we need resolution within days, not weeks. After the video conference ended, Charles sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. Anne's activities weren't just unauthorized. They had apparently evolved from legitimate government consultation into something far more complex and dangerous. When Camilla joined him a short while later, he could see that she had also received disturbing news. Charles, I've just spoken with several of my contacts in London, she said without preamble. There are rumors circulating in certain circles about a member of the royal family being involved in irregular diplomatic activities. The story hasn't reached the press yet, but it's only a matter of time. Charles shared what he had learned from the Prime Minister, watching as Camilla's expression shifted from concern to alarm. So, Anne was originally acting with government approval? She asked. Informal approval, apparently. But the situation evolved beyond anyone's control, and now she's involved with networks that the government can't verify or oversee. Camilla moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where security personnel maintained their constant vigilance. Charles, if this becomes public, the damage to the monarchy could be irreparable. The public will see it as proof that the royal family operates above the law, that we consider ourselves exempt from the rules that govern everyone else. But if we cooperate fully with the government investigation, we might be able to contain the damage, Charles suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Only if and cooperates, Camilla replied. And, based on our conversation this afternoon, that seems unlikely. Charles realized that he needed to speak with and again immediately. The evening's developments had fundamentally changed the nature of their family crisis, transforming it into a matter of national security that required immediate resolution. Where is Anne now? He asked. In her apartments, as far as I know. Charles, when you speak with her, you need to make her understand that this isn't just about family disagreements anymore. Her freedom may literally depend on her cooperation with the government investigation. The walk to Anne's apartments felt longer than usual, each step carrying Charles deeper into a crisis that threatened to engulf everything he had worked to build during his reign. The corridors of Windsor seemed to echo with the weight of history, reminding him of the countless kings and queens who had faced their own moments of decision that would define their legacies. And opened the door herself, still dressed in the clothes she had worn during their afternoon confrontation. Her expression was guarded, though Charles thought he detected a note of weariness that hadn't been present earlier. I assume you're here to continue our discussion, she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. And the situation has changed significantly since we spoke earlier, Charles said without preamble. The government is aware of your activities, and they're demanding your immediate cooperation in a security investigation. He watched as his sister's composed facade finally began to crack. She sank into a chair, her face pale with the realization that her secret had been exposed to the very authorities she had been circumventing. How much do they know? She asked quietly. Everything, apparently, including the fact that your activities began with informal government approval but evolved beyond their oversight. And was silent for several long moments, and Charles could see her mind working through the implications of this new reality. So I'm not just a rogue royal conducting unauthorized diplomacy, she said finally. I'm a security risk who's been compromised by foreign intelligence networks. That appears to be their assessment, Charles confirmed. And you need to understand that this is no longer about constitutional propriety or family loyalty. If you don't cooperate with the investigation, you could face criminal charges. And if I do cooperate, I destroy the networks and relationships that I've spent 5 years building, possibly dooming the humanitarian efforts that depend on those connections. Charles could see the genuine anguish in his sister's face as she grappled with the impossible choice between her personal safety and her commitment to the causes she had been serving. And some choices are made for us by circumstances beyond our control, he said gently. This may be one of those times. She looked up at him with eyes that reflected decades of shared experience, of family bonds that had survived countless challenges and controversies. If I cooperate, will you stand by me? She asked. Will you help me find legitimate ways to continue the humanitarian work that matters so much to me? Of course, Charles replied without hesitation. Whatever happens, you're my sister, and you're a valued member of this family. We'll find a way through this together. And nodded slowly, and Charles could see her beginning to accept the reality of their situation. The conversation that had begun as a family confrontation about unauthorized activities had evolved into something much more complex. A national security crisis that would require the united efforts of the entire royal family to manage effectively. The following morning brought an unprecedented level of activity to Windsor Castle as Charles prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging days of his reign. Teams of government security officials had arrived before dawn to establish secure communication channels and prepare for the extensive debriefing sessions that would be required to untangle 5 years of Anne's unauthorized diplomatic activities. Charles found himself in the unusual position of hosting what amounted to a covert intelligence operation within the walls of his own residence. The irony wasn't lost on him that the monarchy, which had spent centuries learning to operate within carefully defined constitutional boundaries, was now at the center of a crisis involving activities that existed entirely outside those traditional frameworks, and had agreed to cooperate with the investigation. But Charles could see the toll that the decision was taking on her. She arrived at the first briefing session looking as though she hadn't slept, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of the stress she was under. The weight of abandoning years of work and potentially compromising ongoing humanitarian efforts was clearly causing her significant anguish. The lead investigator, a senior official from the Foreign Office named Director Matthews, conducted the initial questioning with professional courtesy, but unmistakable urgency. Charles had been permitted to observe the proceedings, though he quickly realized that his presence was as much about ensuring royal family cooperation as it was about keeping him informed. Princess, and we need to understand the complete scope of your involvement with these networks, Director Matthews began. Every contact, every meeting, every piece of information that was shared or received. Anne's responses were thorough and precise, reflecting the methodical approach that had characterized all of her royal duties. But, as the questioning continued, Charles became increasingly aware of just how extensive and complex his sister's activities had been. The humanitarian crisis in the Balkans required coordination between entities that had no official diplomatic relationships, and explained when asked about one particular intervention. I facilitated 3 separate meetings over the course of 6 months, which resulted in the establishment of aid corridors that saved an estimated 12,000 lives. Director Matthews made careful notes, but his expression remained neutral. And these meetings were conducted without the knowledge or approval of the current government? The previous administration had given informal approval for my involvement in humanitarian mediation, and replied. When the government changed, I assumed that approval continued, particularly since the Foreign Office never contacted me to suggest otherwise. Charles could see the problem immediately. Anne's activities had begun during a different political climate, under different leadership, with different priorities. As governments changed and personnel shifted, the informal arrangements that had initially authorized her involvement had been forgotten or overlooked, leaving her operating in a gray area that had gradually become darker and more dangerous. The questioning continued for hours, revealing the depth of Anne's involvement with international networks that even Charles found surprising. She had been present at meetings involving senior officials from multiple governments, had facilitated negotiations that had prevented at least 2 potential military conflicts, and had established relationships with humanitarian organizations operating in some of the world's most dangerous regions. Your Majesty, Director Matthews said during a brief break, addressing Charles directly, I want you to understand that Princess Anne's activities, while unauthorized, appear to have been conducted with genuine humanitarian motivations. However, the networks she's become involved with include entities whose loyalties and objectives we cannot verify. What does that mean in practical terms? Charles asked. It means that some of the organizations Princess Anne has been working with have connections to private intelligence groups that operate independently of any government oversight. These groups often serve multiple clients with potentially conflicting interests, and their ultimate loyalties may not align with British national interests. The implications were staggering. And hadn't just been conducting unauthorized diplomacy. She had unknowingly become entangled with entities that might be using her royal status and access to serve objectives that were contrary to British interests. When the questioning resumed, Director Matthews' approach became more focused on specific relationships and communications. Princess, and I need to ask you about your contact with an organization called the International Mediation Consortium, he said, consulting his notes. Our investigation suggests that this group has connections to intelligence networks operating on behalf of multiple governments. Charles watched as his sister's face registered recognition and concern. The IMC coordinated most of my recent activities, she admitted. They provided logistical support, security arrangements, and communication facilities for my meetings with foreign officials. Did you ever question how a seemingly independent humanitarian organization was able to provide such sophisticated support services? And was quiet for several moments before responding. I assumed they had legitimate funding sources and government connections that I wasn't privy to. Many international organizations operate with resources and capabilities that aren't immediately apparent to outside observers. Director Matthews exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. Princess, and we have evidence suggesting that the IMC has received funding from intelligence services representing at least 4 different countries. Your activities may have inadvertently served multiple and potentially conflicting national interests. The color drained from Anne's face as the full scope of her situation became clear. She hadn't just been operating without proper authorization. She had been unknowingly manipulated by foreign intelligence networks that had been using her royal status and humanitarian motivations for their own purposes. I need to understand something, Anne said, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you suggesting that everything I've done, all the humanitarian work, all the lives that were saved, that it was all part of some elaborate intelligence operation? Not necessarily, Director Matthews replied with unexpected gentleness. The humanitarian outcomes were likely genuine, but those outcomes may have been secondary to other objectives that you weren't aware of. Intelligence operations often achieve their primary goals by facilitating legitimate secondary activities. Charles felt a profound sadness for his sister as he watched her grapple with the possibility that her years of dedicated work had been exploited by entities whose true motivations she had never understood. The idealism and commitment that had driven her unauthorized activities were the same qualities that had made her vulnerable to manipulation. "What happens now?" Anne asked, echoing the question that was foremost in Charles's mind. "That depends largely on your continued cooperation and your willingness to help us understand and neutralize any ongoing security risks," Director Matthews explained. "We need you to provide us with complete access to all communications, documents, and contact information related to your activities. We also need you to participate in what may be an extended debriefing process. And in return, we'll work to minimize the legal consequences of your unauthorized activities and help you find legitimate channels for your humanitarian work." Charles could see that and was struggling with the decision. Cooperating fully would mean exposing all of the networks and relationships she had built over 5 years, potentially compromising ongoing humanitarian efforts and betraying the trust of people who had relied on her assistance. "Princess," and Director Matthews continued, "I understand that this is difficult, but you need to understand that some of the entities you've been working with pose ongoing risks to British security. Your continued association with these networks could put both you and other members of your family in danger." The mention of family safety clearly affected and profoundly. Throughout her life, she had been protective of her relatives and conscious of her responsibilities to the institution of the monarchy. The idea that her activities might pose risks to Charles or other family members appeared to be the final factor in her decision-making process. "I'll provide everything you need," she said finally. "All documents, all communication records, all contact information. But I want your commitment that you'll work to protect the humanitarian operations that aren't connected to intelligence activities. We'll do everything possible to preserve legitimate humanitarian efforts," Director Matthews assured her. "But our primary responsibility is to British security interests." As the debriefing sessions continued into the afternoon, Charles found himself observing a process that felt surreal in its implications for his family and the monarchy. Government security officials were methodically dismantling a network of relationships and activities that had operated in secret for years, using Windsor Castle as their base of operations. The constitutional implications alone were staggering. A senior member of the royal family had been conducting unauthorized foreign policy activities, had become entangled with international intelligence networks, and had potentially compromised British security interests. If any of this became public, it could fundamentally alter the public's perception of the monarchy's role in modern governance. But perhaps even more troubling for Charles was the personal dimension of the crisis, and had always been the family member he most respected for her dedication to practical service and her refusal to be constrained by purely ceremonial roles. Watching her confront the possibility that her most meaningful work had been exploited by foreign intelligence operations was deeply painful. As evening approached, Charles found himself alone with Camilla in their private quarters, both of them emotionally exhausted by the day's revelations. "How much of this do you think will become public?" Camilla asked, voicing the concern that had been weighing on both of their minds. "That may depend on how successfully the government can contain the security implications," Charles replied. "If Anne's cooperation helps them neutralize any ongoing risks, they may have incentives to keep the details classified. And if it doesn't?" Charles didn't answer immediately, but they both understood the implications. If Anne's activities had created ongoing security risks that required public disclosure or legal action, the monarchy could face its most serious crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII. "We have to trust that Anne's cooperation will be sufficient," Charles said finally. "And we have to prepare for the possibility that it won't be." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Charles's private secretary entered with another urgent communication, this one from the palace press office. "Your Majesty, we've received inquiries from several media outlets about unusual government activity at Windsor Castle today. It appears that someone may have observed the security preparations or the arrival of the investigation team." Charles felt his heart sink. The crisis that they had hoped to manage privately was apparently beginning to attract public attention. "What kind of inquiries?" Camilla asked. "Questions about whether there's been a security incident, whether any member of the royal family is under investigation, and whether the unusual activity is related to intelligence matters." Charles realized that they were rapidly approaching the point where private crisis management would become impossible. Once media attention focused on the investigation, every detail would be scrutinized, analyzed, and reported by outlets around the world. "How do you recommend we respond?" Charles asked his secretary. The standard approach would be to provide no comment on security matters, but that may only intensify speculation. Charles nodded, understanding that they were entering uncharted territory. Never before had the monarchy faced a crisis that involved both national security concerns and potential criminal activity by a senior family member. "Schedule an emergency meeting with the communications team for first thing tomorrow morning," he instructed. "We need to prepare for multiple scenarios, including the possibility of full public disclosure." As his secretary departed, Charles realized that the comfortable privacy in which royal family matters had traditionally been managed was rapidly disappearing. The crisis that had begun with Camilla's discovery of misfiled correspondence was evolving into something that could reshape the monarchy's relationship with the government, the media, and the public. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Charles stood once again at the windows of his study, but the view seemed fundamentally different now. The peaceful grounds of Windsor appeared unchanged, yet everything about his understanding of the monarchy's place in the modern world had been transformed by the crisis that had engulfed his family. The debriefing sessions with and had concluded 2 days earlier, having produced a comprehensive picture of her 5-year involvement with international networks that was both more extensive and more complex than anyone had initially realized. The government's investigation had uncovered connections spanning multiple continents, involving humanitarian organizations, diplomatic intermediaries, and intelligence entities whose relationships created a web of obligations and dependencies that would take months to fully unravel. And herself had emerged from the process visibly changed. The confident, purposeful woman who had defended her unauthorized activities with such conviction had been replaced by someone who appeared genuinely shaken by the extent to which her humanitarian motivations had been exploited by entities with hidden agendas. She had provided complete cooperation with the investigation, but the personal cost of discovering how thoroughly she had been manipulated was evident to everyone who knew her. The morning brought news that Charles had been both expecting and dreading. The Prime Minister's office had requested another urgent meeting to discuss the final assessment of the security investigation and to outline the government's plans for managing the aftermath of Anne's activities. When the secure video connection was established, Charles could see immediately that the Prime Minister looked as exhausted as he felt. The past 3 weeks had clearly been as challenging for the government as they had been for the royal family. "Your Majesty, I want to begin by acknowledging Princess Anne's complete cooperation with our investigation," she said. "Her willingness to provide comprehensive information and to sever all connections with the networks in question has been essential to our ability to assess and mitigate the security risks." "What have you concluded?" Charles asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. "Princess Anne's activities, while unauthorized and problematic, do not appear to have compromised British security interests in any direct way," the Prime Minister explained. "However, the intelligence networks she became involved with did use information from their relationship with her to advance objectives that were not necessarily aligned with British interests." Charles felt a mixture of relief and continued concern. "What kind of objectives?" "Economic intelligence gathering, primarily. Several of the organizations that facilitated Princess Anne's humanitarian work also collected information about British economic policies, trade relationships, and diplomatic strategies. They used their legitimate humanitarian activities as cover for intelligence operations that served foreign commercial interests." The implications were sobering. Anne's work had indeed saved lives and prevented conflicts, but it had also inadvertently provided foreign intelligence services with access to information about British government activities and intentions. "Were any classified materials compromised?" Charles asked. "No direct compromise of classified information has been identified," the Prime Minister replied. "But Princess Anne's presence at high-level meetings and the informal briefings she received to prepare for her humanitarian mediation efforts provided the intelligence networks with insights into British government thinking that could be valuable to foreign competitors." Charles realized that the crisis had revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in the way the royal family operated. Anne's access to government officials and diplomatic information, combined with her international travel and humanitarian activities, had created opportunities for intelligence gathering that neither the royal household nor government security agencies had adequately considered. What measures are being implemented to prevent similar situations in the future? He asked. We're developing new protocols for royal family members who engage in international activities, the Prime Minister explained. Enhanced security briefings, more comprehensive oversight of international contacts, and formal authorization processes for any activities that involve interaction with foreign governments or international organizations. Charles understood that these measures represented a significant change in the way the royal family would operate. The informal freedoms that had allowed family members to pursue their interests and commitments would be replaced by systematic oversight and formal approval processes. And what about and specifically? The Prime Minister's expression became more serious. Princess Anne has agreed to suspend all international travel and activities for a period of 6 months while we ensure that all connections with problematic networks have been severed. After that, any resumption of international humanitarian work will require formal government approval and ongoing oversight. Charles could imagine how difficult these restrictions would be for his sister, who had built her entire royal career around active engagement with international humanitarian causes. The imposed limitations amounted to a fundamental alteration of her role and identity as a working member of the royal family. Will there be any public disclosure of these events? Charles asked, raising the question that had been weighing on his mind throughout the investigation. That decision hasn't been finalized, the Prime Minister replied carefully. The security assessment suggests that public disclosure could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and potentially endanger individuals who cooperated with Princess Anne's humanitarian efforts. However, the constitutional implications of a senior royal family member conducting unauthorized diplomatic activities may require some form of public acknowledgement. Charles understood the delicate balance the government was trying to maintain. Complete secrecy about the incident could create greater problems if the information eventually became public through other channels. But full disclosure could compromise legitimate intelligence operations and create a constitutional crisis about the role of the monarchy in democratic governance. What does the government recommend? We're considering a limited disclosure that acknowledges Princess Anne's involvement in unauthorized humanitarian activities without revealing the intelligence dimensions of the situation. This would allow for public discussion of the constitutional issues while protecting the security aspects of the investigation. After the meeting concluded, Charles found himself facing the most difficult conversation he had yet had with his sister, and had been waiting in the blue drawing room. And he could see immediately that the strain of the past 3 weeks had taken a visible toll on her. The government has completed its assessment, he said, settling into the chair across from her. There will be no criminal charges, but there will be significant restrictions on your future activities. And nodded, as though she had expected this outcome. What kind of restrictions? Charles explained the government's requirements, watching as his sister absorbed the reality that her international humanitarian work would be fundamentally constrained for the foreseeable future. So I'm essentially under house arrest, she said when he finished. You're being protected, Charles corrected gently, both from potential retaliation by intelligence networks and from further inadvertent compromise of security interests. And the family? How has this affected your position as king? Charles had been dreading this question because the honest answer was deeply troubling. The constitutional implications are being reviewed at the highest levels of government, he admitted. This incident has raised serious questions about the oversight of royal family activities and the potential for conflicts between individual family members' initiatives and government policy, and was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the broader implications of her actions. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of profound regret. I never intended for any of this to happen, she said. I thought I was serving the country and the monarchy by using our unique position to help in situations where traditional diplomacy was failing. I know, Charles replied, and the humanitarian outcomes of your work were genuine and valuable. But the intelligence community operates in ways that we don't fully understand, and your good intentions were exploited by entities whose motivations were much more complex than you realized. What happens to the monarchy now? And asked, have I damaged it irreparably? Charles considered his answer carefully. The past 3 weeks had indeed revealed vulnerabilities in the royal family's approach to their public duties that would require fundamental changes. But they had also demonstrated the family's willingness to cooperate with legitimate security concerns and to accept responsibility for their actions. The monarchy will adapt, he said finally, as it always has. We'll accept greater oversight, more formal procedures, and more systematic coordination with government agencies. The informal freedoms we've enjoyed will be reduced, but the institution will survive. And personally, can you forgive me for putting you and the family through this?" Charles looked at his sister, seeing both the woman who had served the monarchy with dedication for over 5 decades, and the individual whose independent spirit had led her into territory that nearly created a constitutional crisis. "And you're my sister, and you've always been one of the hardest working members of this family," he said. "Your motivations were honorable, even if your methods were problematic. Of course I forgive you." The conversation was interrupted by Camilla's arrival, carrying a folder that Charles recognized as containing press clippings and media analysis. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's been a development that you both need to know about." Charles accepted the folder with a sense of foreboding. Inside were printouts of several newspaper articles and online reports speculating about unusual government activity at Windsor Castle and questioning whether a member of the royal family was under investigation for security-related matters. "How close are these reports to the truth?" and asked after reviewing the materials. "Close enough to be concerning," Camilla replied. "The press office believes that someone with knowledge of the investigation has been providing information to journalists, either directly or indirectly." Charles realized that their window for controlling the narrative around Anne's activities was rapidly closing. If media speculation continued to intensify, the government might be forced to provide some form of public disclosure simply to prevent more damaging rumors and conspiracy theories. "What does the communications team recommend?" he asked. "They're preparing multiple scenarios," Camilla explained. "Everything from complete denial to full disclosure, with various options in between. But they're increasingly convinced that some form of acknowledgement will be necessary within the next few days." And stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where her security restrictions now prevented her from traveling freely. "Perhaps it's time," she said quietly. "Perhaps it's time for complete honesty about what happened and what we've learned from it." Charles considered his sister's suggestion. Complete disclosure would certainly be painful for the family and could create significant constitutional discussions. But it might also demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to transparency and accountability, qualities that were essential for maintaining public support in the modern era. "The decision isn't entirely ours to make," he said. "The government has to consider the security implications of full disclosure. But we can influence that decision," Anne replied, turning back to face them. "We can argue for honesty and accountability, even if it's uncomfortable for all of us." As evening fell over Windsor Castle, Charles found himself contemplating a future that looked fundamentally different from the one he had envisioned just a month earlier. The monarchy would survive the crisis that Anne's activities had created, but it would emerge changed, subject to new levels of oversight, and operating within more constrained boundaries. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had forced all of them to confront the reality that individual actions by family members could have far-reaching consequences for the institution they represented. The comfortable assumption that royal family members could pursue their interests and convictions without systematic coordination with government agencies had been shattered, replaced by an understanding that every action carried potential implications for national security and constitutional governance. But as Charles watched his sister accept responsibility for her actions and commit to cooperating with the new restrictions on her activities, he also recognized the same qualities that had made the monarchy resilient for over 1,000 years. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to accept responsibility for mistakes, and to place institutional loyalty above personal preferences remained strong within his family. The crisis that had begun with Camilla's discovery of misfiled correspondence would eventually be resolved, but its lessons would reshape the monarchy for generations to come. Charles could only hope that the institution would emerge stronger and more worthy of the public trust that sustained it.